Hello, everyone. I'm Jean Chatzky. Welcome to Your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. Very glad to have you with me today for what promises to be a very interesting conversation. If you've been watching the news, well, it's been dominated with a lot of talk about policy, what's happening in Washington. And today we are going to talk about policy and how it impacts your retirement. Policy changes that have already come down the pike, policy changes that are likely to come down the pike, policy changes that we think may just happen at some point in the future. As always, I invite you to join me for this conversation. If you have questions as our dialogue goes along, please put them in the comments section. I will be watching for them, picking them up there. We are airing live both on Facebook and LinkedIn. We welcome all of you to the conversation. My guest today is Jeffrey Levine, and Jeff is a financial advisor, a speaker, an educator. He is the lead financial planning nerd, his word, not mine, at Kitsis.com. He is also the chief planning officer for Buckingham Wealth Partners. Previously, he spent years working with Ed Slott, who you all know. He was a prior guest on this show. And he's going to help us understand all of these changes, which ones we should really care about, which ones we should be thinking about, and which ones are really just noise. So, Jeff, welcome to the conversation. I'm so happy to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you today.
So tell me, first of all, a little bit about you. Lead financial planning nerd. Who made that up?
I think it was kind of a combination. You know, the blog where we post all of our thoughts and ideas is called The Nerd's Eye View. So it kind of blends into that sort of approach. And, you know, I'm a self-subscribed nerd. I'm the type of guy and that when the new legislation comes out, the first thing I have to do is read it, and I can't go to sleep until I'm done. Like, I will be up all night reading the proposal from cover to cover. Anything that could possibly impact financial planning, I'm going to read the actual legislation, and I can't stop until I'm done. It's a gift and a curse.
Well, it's good. Now that we know each other, I will know who to call to ask all of my questions. Why is it important that individuals, because this show is largely for individuals, why is it important that we think about policy as it pertains to retirement and to our finances in general?
Sure. I think there's really two answers to that question. The first is just being a broader part of society. I think part of our responsibility is to know what's going on and to be informed so that we can make educated decisions about, you know, who we put in power, who goes to Washington. Votes matter, and we have to decide where we cast our vote, because then our leaders go and cast their vote as to what policies they want. But beyond that, the more close to home answer to this is that hopefully we're all going to get to that point where we work not because we have to, but because we want to. Mm-hmm. And those policies that are enacted in Washington, you know, maybe right next door, but in some cases thousands of miles away, have a real material impact on our ability to do that, whether that be through what sort of programs are available to retirees, how much those programs cost, what taxes will look like, et cetera. These are all key elements that go into figuring out whether or not our retirement is going to be successful, and when or not, or when we can do that comfortably.
So before we talk about policies that might be on the table right now, that before we take a look into the future, I'd love to explore some changes that already happened. They happened a couple of years ago, but we were, as you said earlier, we were kind of busy for the last couple of years. We were a little preoccupied. A law called the Secure Act, Secure 1.0. Tell me about this, and then let's dig into a few of its provisions.
Sure. Well, the law at a high level, which actually enjoyed bipartisan support, which I know is a very strange thing to say these days, but it was meant to help tighten up some of the gaps in the retirement system. But I think the single biggest takeaway for most individuals who have done a good job saving over their lifetime was that there was a massive change in the way the post-death distribution rules worked. Prior to the Secure Act, when an individual inherited an IRA, a 401k, et cetera, if they were named on the beneficiary form, the general rule was that they were able to so-called stretch distributions. In other words, they could take small amounts out of that inherited IRA or the inherited 401k over the course of their lifetime. If it was a 40-year-old, that was more than 40 years. If you left money to a young grandchild, it could have been 60, 70 plus years of continued tax deferral and limited distributions. By contrast, the Secure Act makes the default, save for a few select groups of individuals, I'll cover them in a moment, but except for those select few groups, the default now is that everything that's in an inherited IRA has to come out within 10 years. Now, within the 10 years, you have total flexibility. You could take a lot out early and then a little bit out late. You could take none out during the first 9 years and then all in the 10th year. But it all has to be out by the end of the 10th year after death. And obviously, the difference between 40 years of tax deferral or more and 10 years is quite significant. So that has a material impact on the amount, the net dollars that an heir might receive when they inherit these accounts. And so owners, you during your lifetime, if you're the IRA owner, 401k owners, if that's you, it's your account, you might want to think about what actions you can take during your lifetime if you believe some or all of those dollars may be left to your heirs to mitigate more of that account being taken up by taxes. Ultimately, the goal is get money to others as efficiently as possible, right?
So what does that mean in practical terms? When you're thinking about your heirs, what does that mean in terms of the age of those heirs? What does it mean about what you should do, while you're still alive in order to get money out of that IRA?
So let's look at a really simple example here. Let's say we have someone who's 75 years old and who is retired, and they're contemplating, end of life things, which no one really likes to contemplate, but at some point we get there. So let's imagine that we're going through this process. And if we think we're 75 years old, maybe our children are, 50 years old or so forth. They might be right in the prime of their high earning years. Yeah. And if something happens to us today, not only would they potentially have to take that account out in 10 years, but they'd have to be adding all that other income on top of the other income they have during their high earning years at work. So one of the things we might do is if we thought, gee, I have more than enough, I'll be leaving some of this over for my children, my grandchildren, et cetera. One of the things that we could do is potentially convert during our own lifetimes and pay the tax essentially for our children. In some cases, it might even make sense. Let's imagine that 50-year-old was a doctor or a lawyer or some other high earner. Maybe they give mom and dad some money to pay the income tax and the conversion, essentially buying or using mom and dad's tax rate to pay that tax liability, as opposed to ending it back in their income tax return or having it on their tax return when mom or dad dies. Again, hopefully many years in the future. But what will that look like for that next generation?
It's a lot to think about. Another thing that was part of the Secure Act is that RMDs, required minimum distributions, were pushed back. Can you talk about that? Explain who was impacted and how we should all be changing our plans as a result.
Sure. So I would say first off that only a minority of people were really impacted by that change. Now, in fairness, you could say, well, doesn't that mean every IRA owner, why just a minority of people? Isn't it all IRA owners? Well, prior to that change, about 80% of all individuals with retirement accounts were already taking more than their required minimum distribution. And if you're already taking more than your RMD, you're doing so not because you're required to, but because you want to, because you have to, right? You got to put food on the table. You've got to pay for the roof over your heads, all of these types of decisions. So the government telling you, well, you don't have to take as much doesn't help you if you already need it. But for that 20% or so who didn't need the money at that time, it bought another year and a half or so of tax deferral, another year and a half where you didn't have to take money out of your account. Maybe it meant you could let those dollars compound for the future, for yourself or for your heirs. Maybe it's a few more years of a lower tax liability, or a few more years of being able to take more gains from your portfolio at a tax efficient rate. It simply meant you weren't forced to do that. Certainly could, but weren't forced to. And obviously, again, that benefits disproportionately those who have the ability to wait because they don't otherwise need those dollars.
Gotcha. Okay. A third thing that happened, and I just want to sort of tick off these provisions in the law that was already passed for anybody who's just joining us. Jeff Levine and I are talking about policy and how policy impacts your retirement. These are changes that come down from Washington that we have no control over except in our votes and casting our votes for the people who make policy, but that we all need to be aware of, and that we need to be able to react to in the smartest ways to protect our money. One of the other changes that came through as a part of the Secure Act 1.0 was that the ability to contribute to IRAs was extended past age 70 and a half. Again, we're talking rarefied air here. This is not something that anyone and everyone, this is not something that everyone is able to do simply because not everyone has the money to do it. But can you talk about when it makes sense?
Sure. If you are 70 and a half or older and still working, that would give you the ability to do that. Or if you have a spouse who's still working and you're 70 and a half, you could do what's called a spousal contribution, effectively borrow some of the earnings of your spouse to make that traditional IRA contribution. And I have to say, this is one where I'm really happy that they made this change. It really simplifies things. Prior to the Secure Act, traditional IRAs were kind of on an island to themselves. It was the only type of retirement account that you couldn't contribute to after 70 and a half. Had a Roth, wanted to make Roth IRA contributions. If you had earned income and were below the income limits, no problem. Had a 401k, a 403b, a 457b plan, a thrift savings plan, a SEP IRA, a simple IRA. I could go on, like all perfectly fine to contribute to after 70 and a half. The lone exception was traditional IRAs. Going forward, that is completely fine. No matter what your age is, you can contribute. The only thing you need to have is compensation, which for most individuals is earned income, like W-2 wages or self-employment income.
Gotcha. And can I just do a small public service announcement for this spousal IRA for a
Go for it.
second?
Yes.
I'm a big fan of the spousal IRA. We've seen through the pandemic so many people take a step out of work. In particular, so many women take a step back from work, albeit temporarily in many cases. If you're out of the workforce for whatever reason and you have a spouse who is eligible to make an IRA contribution, then you are eligible to make an IRA contribution for yourself, and you absolutely should if you have the money to do it. We've got a question coming in from Jason. Jason asks, did the 401k tax taken on withdrawals in retirement increase recently, or has that happened yet?
So ultimately, the taxation of 401k distributions is going to be dependent upon what your personal income tax situation looks like and how much other income you have, as well as the tax rates at that time. So there's no like special tax brackets for just 401k distributions. We look at all your other income and we add kind of whatever you take out of your 401k on top of that. And then wherever that sits. So if you're in the 22% bracket and you've got enough space there, and you add some more income, then you might be paying a 22% rate. Whereas your neighbor, maybe at a cubicle next to you, retired at the same time, but has a slightly lower income, they're in a 12% bracket. So they pay a 12% rate. So you have to look at your personal situation. I suspect perhaps that what the question is really asking is, did the brackets change? Have we seen the tax law that is being proposed happen yet? And the answer to that is no. And Gene and I are going to be getting into that in just a little bit here.
But thank you, Jason, for the question. And if the rest of you who are watching, if anybody else has a question, please pose it in the comments section. We'd be happy to come to it. Before I leave the law that has already passed, Jeff, one of the other things that happened was that we are going to start seeing more annuities in 401ks. Can you talk about why that is and how we should be thinking about this new option?
Sure. So let's take the first part of that first, and then we'll address the second part afterwards. So why is it that we're going to see a little bit more of these over the years? Well, historically, 401ks have been able to use an annuity as an investment option, but very, very few did. And there were two primary concerns for folks when it came to 401ks using annuities as investments. First, if you're the plan fiduciary, right? If you're a trustee of the plan, you have a fiduciary obligation to do the right thing for your plan participants. And plan participants can sue plan trustees, not only as the plan, but they can sue them personally. So there's personal liability on the part of these individuals. And you have to imagine, if you're a trustee, do you really want to bet your own finances on the fact that not only would an insurance company be around today, but 20, 30 years from now, when it would continue to need to pay out, let's say, income to meet its promises that it makes today? That was a real challenge. And so one of the ways the Secure Act tries to solve that is it created a new safe harbor. Effectively, if a plan trustee checks and makes sure that those fees are reasonable that are being charged by the annuity company, and they do some due diligence in terms of making sure the insurance company can meet its obligations, then the plan trustee effectively has a safe harbor that they have met their fiduciary requirements. So it reduces the risk to those individuals personally and makes them more comfortable with perhaps bringing on one of those investments to the plan. The other thing the Secure Act did was it solved the problem that existed for many years, which is, what if I was comfortable as a plan fiduciary to put this on my lineup, right? So next to your large cap mutual fund, your small cap mutual fund, your mid cap mutual fund, your bond fund, et cetera, all of a sudden you see annuity X there. What if I was comfortable with that now, but later on I decide I'm not? How do you switch that, right? If it was typically, well, I didn't like this large cap fund, I want to replace it with this one. We just map the money from one to the other. It's done.
Right.
But with respect to annuities, sometimes there's no surrender value at all, right? It's effectively locked up in the annuity. The way the Secure Act deals with it, it says, even if you're still working, even if you're young, that annuity can effectively be spun out as its own investment. It will leave the plan, if you will, and become an IRA annuity as opposed to a 401k annuity. This way, if the plan trustee decides to get rid of that investment, you're not losing your dollars that were invested in there in the first place. So that's why we see potentially these changes and why we might see more. I still think it will take a long time because plans are notoriously very slow to adopt new things that they don't have to. Still seeing plans bring on Roth 401ks and other things that have been allowed for many years but weren't required. So I don't think this is going to be like a rush out to put annuities in a plan, but we will certainly start to see more of them as a result of these changes.
And if you are a consumer or an investor, an employee who starts to see this option in your 401k, how do you know if it's right for you? I mean, I guess it's the same question outside of a 401k. How do you make the call if adding some supplemental lifetime income to your Social Security benefit is going to be a good option for you down the road?
So a lot of this comes down to how much risk are you willing to take in your retirement, and what are your key concerns? And for a lot of people, it's, I don't want to run out of money before I run out of life.
Right.
And if that's
it for me.
Yeah. So an annuity, and particularly an income generating annuity, Gene, you and I have talked previously about the word annuity and how I don't particularly care for the word annuity, not the product annuity, but the word annuity, because it encompasses so many very different things. You've got variable annuities that are effectively like investment vehicles. You've got fixed annuities, which operate a little bit like CDs at a bank, but not FDIC insured, but kind of that stated interest rate that you will get. And then you've got these income annuities, the traditional sort of annuity that we might think of as your grandparents' annuity, right? Where, hey, here, insurance company, here's a pile of money. Now pay me a check once a month for the rest of my life, something like that. Those in particular enjoy a lot of academic support. And I want to be very clear here. I don't work for an insurance company. I don't sell annuities. I get nothing for them. I work with a fee-only financial advisory firm. There is academic evidence to support particularly the use of longevity annuities, things like qualified longevity annuity contracts, a type of contract that was created by the IRS back in 2014 to use within retirement accounts as a way to mitigate longevity risk. And I would add, Gene, that when I talk to people about why they don't use these types of things, the number one answer I typically hear from folks is, well, we didn't want to spend all that money on an annuity when we could otherwise, like it would make us spend less during our life because we invested in this annuity. And oftentimes it's precisely the opposite. If we think about the core problem with respect to retirement, it's we don't know when you're going to die. So I might need to reserve funds for much longer in your plan than is really necessary based on what happened, right? I might say, well, we have to make sure that if you live to 95, you don't run out of money. But what if you actually died at 80 or 85? Well, you didn't spend those dollars because what if? But imagine now I had an annuity that started, I invested at 65, it didn't pay me anything for 20 years. And then at 85, a brand new income stream kicked on. And if that income, enough with, let's say, my Social Security, et cetera, was enough to last no matter what. Well, now, even though I may theoretically live like forever, right? I could live to be 86 or 180. It doesn't matter at that point. From a financial planning point, I only need to make your portfolio last from 65 to 85. There's a defined end to that period. And so it can actually allow folks to spend more because they don't have to keep as much in reserve for later years. So I like to dispel that myth of it will mean I spend less.
Right. And we've actually seen that in some interesting studies that have shown when people know that the money will continue to come, they feel able to be a little more freewheeling, I guess, for lack of a better word, with their spending. I want to turn to the policy initiatives that have not happened yet, the ones that we believe are coming down the pike, the ones that we think might come down the pike. So let's start with the news that we know for sure. What is going to happen in the near future? I mean, I know we've got some new tables coming for RMDs, for required minimum distributions. Can you talk about that and who that will impact?
Sure, absolutely. That impacts anyone who has an IRA, 401k, et cetera. There will be a lowering of the mandatory required minimum distributions beginning next year. This was actually a holdover from a few years ago. There was an executive order from President Trump that asked the IRS to look at some of this stuff. It was originally thought that it would start this year, but they released the proposed regulations, which had those tables so late last year. Would have been very difficult for organizations to have implemented that effective for 2021. So they just pushed back the effective date. So beginning in 2022, regardless of, again, whether it's an IRA, 401k, 403b, whatever that retirement account may be, folks will have the ability to take out slightly less. It amounts to, at the starting age, is about 5% less. So if your RMD last year would have been 10,000, or this year was 10,000, next year it would be worth about 9,500. The precise difference varies by age, but that's a good overall assumption as a starting point.
Again, a good problem to have, right?
That's right.
I mean, if you for many people, the goal is to make the money last longer and not take out as much. So I understand.
And that's precisely why they did this, right? Is because people are living longer than when they published the original tables. And so they want to reflect that by requiring less come out each year so that the money can last longer for these longer life expectancies we're seeing.
Well, sadly, we've had a little bit of a dip, right, in life expectancy during COVID. So I hopefully things will just pick right back up again with the vaccines. What's likely in terms of upcoming legislation? We're going to get some general tax legislation, right? What is that looking like?
Higher taxes for some. I think that is, if I was pinned down to say, like, what is the most likely outcome? It's higher taxes for those with significant income each year. Now, what that line ultimately looks like is still a little bit up in the air, but I'm pretty confident at this point we are going to see a 39.6% top ordinary income tax bracket next year. The bigger question for me is, where does that actually begin? And there's some different thoughts out there. So some people are saying, well, maybe we should just swap out the current 37% bracket and replace it with 39.6%. So that would impact much fewer people, because right now the top ordinary income tax bracket, if you're a married couple and file a joint return, doesn't start till over $600,000 of taxable income. So in effect, unless you had more than that, you wouldn't be impacted if they change, just swap out, if you will, 1-for-1 replacement. 37% gets scratched off and replace it with 39.6. There's some other thoughts out there, like President Biden proposed earlier this year in his Green Book, his budget request, his formal budget request to Congress. He said, let's just pretend as if the Tax Cut and Jobs Act didn't happen. And let's start 39.6% where it would have otherwise been, which for married folks would have been about $530,000 or so. The recent bill that is put forth in the House of Representatives actually scales that back even further and would start 39.6% rate at just $450,000. So everybody seems to agree 39.6% is the magic number as the top rate. The question is, where and at what income level do we start that? I think we're also likely to see changes on the capital gains front as well. Once again, there being a higher top income tax rate, although there is a lot more discussion on that end of what the ultimate top rate will be as opposed to on the ordinary income tax side.
And there's so much back and forth happening, particularly within the Democratic Party right now. I mean, if you were betting, where do you think this is all going to shake out?
Oh man, it is so hard to predict right now. So hard, particularly because there are a few things at play here. First off, whether you're Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, you're putting aside your political affiliation. There are just some things that we have to objectively view about our two parties right now. Republicans, for instance, are a much more united party, particularly when it comes to tax policy. Democrats, on the other hand, are much more fractured. And probably the best example we have of this is the SALT cap, the state and local tax deduction cap. On one hand, you have a whole contingent of Democrats who ran and campaigned and pledged and promised, we're going to repeal this cap that was put in place by Republicans back in we will get rid of this for you if you elect us. And they want to make sure that they follow through on that pledge. On the other hand, if you look at where the value of the SALT cap is, in other words, who benefits from this, it is disproportionately those at the very high income spectrum. Much of that benefit would end up at the top 1% of all income tax earners, which you then have a different part of the Democratic, the caucus saying, well, hang on one second. If we give all that money back to those at the top 1%, it's going to stop us from being able to move forward all these other very progressive and really cool initiatives that we have in mind that we were talking about. So within the Democratic Party, there's a lot of, I don't want to say infighting, but there's a lot of negotiations that have to go on behind the scenes and perhaps some in public as well to get us to a resolution where they can all move forward with confidence. The other part of this that makes it so difficult is the margins, right? Just the overall margins in the House and in the Senate.
Yeah.
A lot of people have compared this and said, well, look what Democrats did back in 2000, late 90s under Clinton, right? And well, we look at that, but it's not a great marker. Yes, Democrats did have control of the president, the office of the presidency, the House, the Senate, et cetera. But when they passed the bill that changed the top rate from then 31 to 39.6% and made some other changes, more than 40 Democrats in the House of Representatives voted against the bill. And 6 Democratic senators voted against the bill. It actually led to then Vice President Gore having to cast the deciding vote. But today, we're in a situation where if just 4 people in the House of Representatives, 4 Democrats voted against the bill, or just a single Democratic senator did the same, the bill's done. It can't go anywhere. And so it gives any single individual, particularly in the Senate, a disproportionate level of power to kind of raise their hand and say, yeah, I don't like that provision as it is. And if you don't do this, I won't vote for you. And there's only 3 outcomes then. Either one, Democrats will just say, all right, well, we tried, but we couldn't get it done. That seems really unlikely. I mean, I can't imagine the political the political fallout of not doing anything. That seems unlikely. Possibility number 2 is they negotiate and they find some resolution with that individual who, one person can kind of drive the other 49 because those 49 need that vote. The other possibility is that Democrats as a caucus just put a tremendous amount of political pressure on that one person to say, all right, I changed my mind, I'll go along with you. But we just don't know. And so it's really hard to handicap like what is ultimately going to be here relative to, I think, any time in recent history. I can't think of another time where it's been more difficult to predict the ultimate outcome. And that makes things hard for a few reasons. One is just we don't know, but two, some things we might want to act on before the end of the year. But if we end up with a late year passing, as has been the case in recent history, Tax Cut and Jobs Act,
Right.
passed in December, the Secure Act, which we talked about earlier, we said, hey, a big change for people, went from stretch to 10 years. That got passed on December 20th of 2019 and began impacting individuals 11 days later. So Congress may not give us much time to plan for what could be really impactful changes.
Well, and that makes the end of the year tax planning that we are all encouraged to do incredibly difficult, let alone causes delays in the forms coming out from the IRS. TurboTax needs more time to get everything ready. I mean, the dominoes just start to fall. But I did want to say thank you. I mean, that was a very, very good explanation of why we are reading so much about Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. So thank you. Thank you for the history lesson, and thank you for that. We've talked a lot on this program, especially about Roth conversions.
Sure.
Ed Slott, who I know you know well, you worked together for a long time, has been a guest on this show, and he in particular has been out there encouraging people, put money into a Roth, put money into an account where you are protected against tax increases. You call this tax insurance, but it looks like we might lose some of that tax insurance in the next round of policy changes. Can you talk about why and what we should do now?
Yeah, sure. As part of this proposed legislation that's working its way through Congress right now, that the House Ways and Means Committee pushed out recently, beyond just the headline news of, hey, we're going to change tax rates for certain folks, there are some other real policy changes behind that. And one of those key changes would be the prohibition of conversions of after-tax dollars beginning January 1st of next year. And to be very clear, because I've seen this reported inaccurately in a couple places, that applies to everyone beginning January 1st, if the law is enacted as it is proposed right now. Right? It's not just for high earners. It's not just for those with large retirement accounts or high income. That would apply across the board beginning in 2022. Any after-tax dollars in any retirement accounts would not be eligible to convert. So
now, wait, I'm going to stop you for 1 second.
Because otherwise I'll just go on forever.
No, when you say after-tax dollars in a retirement account, there've been a number of stories from ProPublica and others about these massive Roth conversions.
Yes.
Those, that's the case in which we're talking about after-tax dollars. If I put $6,000 into a traditional IRA and I want to convert that, is this what we're talking about, or is this a different beast entirely?
So great question. So there are two ways in which an individual can actually get after-tax dollars into a retirement account. And one thing I want to be extraordinarily clear on here is when we're talking about after-tax dollars, we are not talking about Roth dollars. Even though Roth money is technically after tax because there was no deduction for it, those are Roth dollars. What we're talking about here is non-deductible money, after-tax money that is on the traditional side of a retirement account. And so possibility number one is you have a 401k, a 403b, some other type of retirement plan that either you and or your spouse are in what they call an active participant in, meaning you're saving in your 401k each year and so forth. If that's the case, if you're an active participant or your spouse is in an employer plan and your income exceeds certain levels, it takes both of those things, right? You need both active participation and high income. If that's the case, then you may be prohibited from taking a deduction for a contribution you make to your IRA. And where the confusion comes in here is people think, oh, I can't make a contribution to my IRA. My income is too high and I have this plan. That's not true. You can make the contribution. You just wouldn't be able to deduct it. And so if you can't deduct it, that creates after-tax dollars. Now, in an employer plan, it's less common, but where it's there, it can be a much bigger deal because of the larger dollar amounts. Effectively, there are two limits for employer plans that apply, right? There is the $19,500 salary deferral limit that most people pay attention to because that's potentially where they could max out. There is a second limit of what's called the overall limit or the annual additions limit, which caps the total dollars that go into the plan. That's your own deferrals, that's the employer's match, that's the profit sharing component, all of that goes in. And this year, that's a $58,000 limit. Well, if we imagine, just a hypothetical, Gene, that you deferred $19,500 into the plan, and your employer maybe matched and put in another $8,500. Well, collectively, that $19,500 plus $8,500 equals $28,000. The $58,000 overall limit and the $28,000 amount that went into the plan already, well, there's a gap there. We've got space to fill, if you would. If your plan allows, and if a couple of other ifs, ands, and so forth are met, then you can actually put $30,000 more from your salary into that plan. It wouldn't be deductible, but it would be in the plan on the pre-tax side. Then what people do is once they have after-tax dollars in an IRA like this or a plan like this, you commonly hear this referred to as the backdoor Roth or the mega backdoor Roth if it's done in a plan. It kind of sounds like a monster of some kind, but this mega backdoor Roth or backdoor Roth, you then take those after-tax dollars and you convert them to a Roth IRA. And the whole benefit of this is if those after-tax dollars remain on the traditional side, right, in the traditional IRA or the traditional 401k, every dollar of growth that is generated on them for the rest of your life will continue to be taxable at some point, either to you or to your heirs once you're gone. Whereas if you put it in a Roth IRA in a conversion, now it will all be tax-free. And because you're converting all after-tax dollars, there's not a cost to that conversion. It's effectively a tax-free conversion.
Right.
In the plan, you can do this, or if it's in an IRA and you have no other IRA money, you can do this. And it's kind of a little bit of a game, if you will, to beat the system. And so Congress is looking to close that loophole effective next year.
Neil is wondering, are they proposing limits or elimination of pre-tax dollars for Roth conversion?
No, they are not proposing limit. So for pre-tax dollars, they're not proposing any limits on like an amount that you couldn't convert. However, it's worth noting that they are looking at if you are a high income individual. The limits there, off the top of my head, if I recall correctly, was $400,000 of a new type of income, adjusted taxable income, another income to keep track of, like AGI, MAGI, taxable income. Now we'll have ATI on top of it, like 8 ways to calculate income on your return. This adjusted taxable income, if you exceeded that, you would not be allowed to convert beginning in 2032. So like 10 plus years from now. Now, that is what the proposal says. That's one thing. Gene, you asked, like, what's some things we don't think may happen?
Mm-hmm.
I think even if that got codified today, by the time we got to 2032, that would be repealed for 2 reasons. First, when you get to 2032, the congressmen and women at that time are going to want the money from rich people who are converting on the books, right? They're going to want that income over their 10-year budget window to make things look good, for them to balance the budget maybe, or to be able to pay for other things. So by allowing conversions at that time, they would effectively juice the revenue in those years. The second thing is, if you recall back in 2009 and earlier, there were rules that said if you make too much money, you can't convert. It was $100,000 at that time. And if someone accidentally converted because they made too much money, maybe they got a bonus they didn't expect at the end of the year, they were able to undo it via a Roth recharacterization. But that's gone. So what happens if you unexpectedly got money and you went over those limits? How do you undo a conversion that you can't and you can't just bring back recharacterizations or undo the conversion for only rich people. Like that won't go over very well. So I think for all those reasons and some more, that's one of those provisions where it's in there, but I'm not worried about it. And even in a worst case scenario, you have 10 years to get your stuff together.
Okay, that is a really, really good point. And it brings me to something that I've wanted to ask this whole conversation. Congress changes the rules. The laws change, and sometimes they change for a very short period of time, and sometimes they change for a much longer period of time.
Mhm.
How are individuals supposed to keep up? And when we are trying to plan for something as inevitable as retirement, are there any best practices that we should be adhering to no matter what happens?
Sure. So I think I want to start by saying that I believe, and I'm clearly biased because this is where I spend my entire life, but I believe this is where the help of a good professional can really be of assistance here. There's just so much complexity between tax law and markets and what will inflation do and what are interest, like there's just a lot there. I am a big believer in having an advisor. I don't make my own decisions without speaking with my own financial advisor, because you have blind spots, and it's not just blind spots of knowledge, it's blind spots of emotion, right? Emotion is the enemy for long-term success when it comes to finances. You have to try and remove it as much as you can. It's very difficult to do on your own. So I think that's the first thing, finding the right mix of professionals for you, your tax team, your financial advising team, your estate planning team. Having that set up, I think, can be incredibly valuable, because it's just too much for any one person to know. The second thing I think that's critical is to try and take the long view.
Mhm.
There are lots of these, as you mentioned, kind of short-term changes, and it's really difficult to say, look, in 20 years, tax policy is going to be this. I mean, it's so far in the future that it's tax policy could change 4 or 5 times significantly before that, and it wouldn't be a complete shock. And given the polar opposites our parties are at today, not just in tax policy, but just about everything, these wild swings we might be prone to more of them. When you enact legislation through reconciliation, as both parties have done recently, Democrats did it back with Obamacare, Republicans followed that up with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Now Democrats are looking at doing, when you pass it with no bipartisan support, it means that the other party, as soon as they have the ability to remove it or change it, is more likely to do it, right? If you do something together, even if it's not like 50-50 support, but where you have some bipartisan support, it makes it harder to repeal those policies. Well, we're just not there in our current political climate. So I think you've got to look and make some judgment calls in your life and say, what do I think? And this requires some educated guessing, but I'll tell you, my concern is higher taxes in the future. I think that is a much more likely path than lower taxes. And that's not to say I want that or don't. This is not a political statement here as to what I want. This is regardless of what I personally want, I think we are going to see higher tax rates, and not just for those at the ultra high income. You talked about the 39.6% rate before, and people might say, well, I don't care. I'm not making $4 or $5 or $600,000. So what do I care? Well, it's important to remember, just if we look a few years into the future, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was passed by Republicans a few years ago lowered taxes for about 3/4 of taxpayers, right? About 3 out of every 4 taxpayers saw their tax liabilities drop as a result of those changes. But most of those changes sunset. In other words, they go away. They go back to the old rules at the end of 2025. So if that happens and the changes that are going away saved 3/4 of people taxes, well, naturally, if they go away, about 3/4 of people will see higher taxes as a result of that. And that's scheduled to happen right now and is on the books. All we have to do is run out the clock. So I think future taxes are much likely to be higher. And that can mean doing some things that don't make a lot of sense, intuitively, like paying more tax now. Right.
Right.
We talked about the Roth conversion. That is a great way. I do refer to it as tax insurance. I will pay the premium today. In other words, my cost of the conversion for the potential benefit in the future for eliminating my tax rate. And not for everything. That doesn't mean that everyone should convert everything, but it's worth having that discussion. Pushing off the liability indefinitely only works mathematically when we think that tax liability in the future is going to be lower than it is.
Mhm.
Otherwise, if you think it's going to be higher, and it's not just brackets, it's your rate that matters.
Right.
So if you're married and file a joint tax return and one of you passes away, what happens to the survivor? Well, they don't get to use those nice big joint brackets anymore. They have to use single filer brackets. You get to the higher income thresholds or the higher brackets at half the income. So that can push up someone's rates, even though they have lower income. They would have lost the lower Social Security check, but all the interest is the same, all the dividends are the same, all the capital gains are the same. The IRA distributions are likely pretty similar. You've got the higher Social Security check. So folks end up with what is called like the widow's penalty or widower's penalty, where you have slightly less income and pay a higher tax bill on that slightly less income. Roth conversion can reduce that risk. So pulling some risk off the table, I think, is one of those things that is at least worth considering. Again, I don't want to say everyone should do it for everything, but it is worth at least considering as part of your long-term planning if, like me, you believe tax rates are likely to rise.
I am absolutely with you on that. You are incredible. This is so much great information. Jeff, if people are interested in following your work, in getting in touch with you or reading more of what you have to say, what's the best place to do that?
No, thank you so much. So a few places. You can find me on Twitter at CPA Planner. So pretty simple, cpaplanner.com, or excuse me, CPA Planner as the handle. And anytime there's a big piece of tax legislation, one of my big things is I break it down right away with a tweet storm, if you will, followed with lots of gifts. So this last one, we're talking about this proposal here. If you go right now, the pinned tweet on my profile is a breakdown of this proposed legislation. 84 tweets, all with the office.
Oh my gosh.
All with the
tweets.
office gifts. It's a great ride. We have a lot of fun doing it, and it's kind of become its own thing. It's taken on its own life as new proposals have come out. But beyond that, you can certainly go to kitces.com. That's KITCES.com and read the Nerd's Eye View. And if you're a consumer and you're looking for help with this sort of planning, the firm I work with, Buckingham Wealth Partners, you can check us out at Buckingham SW, short for Strategic Wealth, buckinghamsw.com. We'd love to speak with you and help answer any questions we can. So those are the best bets. But of course, thanks to you, Gene, for this incredible opportunity. There's so much information that so many people need, and anytime I get a chance to have this opportunity to speak to folks, it's always a privilege.
Well, I am sure that we will talk again soon. My thanks to the Alliance for Lifetime Income for bringing us these conversations. And if you're looking for more information, please check out our website at protectedincome.org. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye.